This is a kind of breathless tour of modern theology, as you know, but in order to keep ourselves connected in some kind of sense of before and after, I think it's always good just to touch back a little as to what we worked on last week and to see how some of those threads help us to connect to looking at Friedrich Schleiermacher today. One of the reasons that I thought it would be good to start with Charles Taylor's magnum opus, A Secular Age, is that it both gives a very full account of, if you will, the context of experience and belief in a secular world. He emphasizes in particular a series of characteristics, but one that really jumps out for me is the dominance in a secular world of what he calls disengaged reason. That is the reason that is, I think, probably exemplified in scientific thinking, although it's obvious in a lot of other forms of thinking as well. We don't want to bring personal preferences or emotion into the reasoning about any formal kind of claims we make. We want to be disengaged in order to be objective. And that, of course, often then makes for real challenges when we look at the traditions of religious thinking and religious history that have substantial engagement. But what I've often found particularly interesting in Taylor then, since he is a religious thinker, his large magnum opus really was for the first time that he more fully developed his sense of his own religiousness as a very broad Catholic thinker. And in seeing then him stacking up all the challenges of religion in a secular age, we find several key points at which he wants to then suggest that, if you will, disengaged reason doesn't do it. That it has to be supplemented and is supplemented in the ways in which we live our lives by other forms of human intelligence. And so, for example, we worked a bit last time with the idea of what he calls the human quest for fullness. And the search for fullness is not a function of disengaged reason, although reason certainly operates in humans trying to find some sense of fullness in their lives. He says this is, if you happen to have the paper and you wanted to follow, it's on page 10. This is the paper from last week. But he says, we all see our lives and/or the space wherein we live our lives as having a certain moral, spiritual shape. Somewhere in some activity or condition lies a fullness, a richness. That is, in that place, activity, or condition, life is fuller, richer, deeper, more worthwhile, more admirable, more what it should be. At one place, Taylor suggests the inescapable presence of fullness in response to the common question, what do we most admire people for? So in a sense, there's this inevitability in our experience of wanting to reach further and go deeper. And often, we find that in art, in music, in communing with nature, in deep relationships with others, in finding ourselves in various ways in the power and sometimes in the majesty of things that transcend us. He then goes on to say, a lot of those questions come to focus around the issues of personal identity. When we ask ourselves, well then, who then am I? How do those elements of fullness for which we seem to always be seeking come into organization around a sense of who then are we? He puts it this way, and as you recall from his discussions of secularism, you'll hear again one element of what's changed in the modern world. Who am I is no longer answered by referring to our genealogy or our class, or our occupation, or our tribe? It's answered then this way. What does answer this question for us as moderns is an understanding of what is of crucial importance to us. What is of crucial importance to us? Now that's a form of human intelligence, but it's not a form of disengaged reason. What is of crucial importance to us is a question that everyone answers and around which we build our identities. But we don't get there by disengaged reason. To know who I am is a species of knowing where I stand. So there's inevitability of finding a place to stand, the values that count for you, the relationships that are of critical importance. The quest for fullness is enacted over a lifetime, and the intense and unrelenting effort to make sense of our lives necessarily takes a narrative form. Taylor suggests that we must determine our lives in narrative form as a quest which is an inescapable structural requirement of human agency, of humans as enacting their lives. Now, it happens that if I were to turn to some biblical readings, I think you might begin to find some very close connections between the idea of narrative identity and what, in scriptures, and what Taylor is talking about. If you look at the people of Israel's quest for a relationship with God, it's structured, much of it, of course, not all of it, but much of it in narrative form. It's all about promise-making and promise-keeping. Promise-making and promise-keeping is not done by disengaged minds. Promise-making and promise-keeping is what persons do. And so the identity of ourselves as persons becomes, for Taylor, one of those places in which all the characteristics of a secular world don't take, because they have to do with another kind of intelligence. He says other things, and this, I think, should be said particularly in the Reformed tradition with a particular interest in human fallibility. Often this sense of fullness in our lives is lost. We feel disconnected. We don't feel that sense of vitality. We feel, in fact, then that there's a kind of spiritual exile, and that we try to get back from that spiritual exile, that sense of lostness, that sense of distance from what we most care about, and struggle often to do that. Another point. There is in Taylor a whole long section that he calls conversions. And in those sections, he's trying to find modern thinkers who have had a turning point in their lives where their immersion in a secular culture hasn't fully satisfied. And he gives examples in particular of literary figures who've often then found religious faith. Jared Manley Hopkins, a late 19th century English writer, became a Jesuit priest early in his life, and then often wrote in terms of a kind of almost mystical insight about the presence of God. But he had been prior a very hard-nosed secular thinker. In a slightly different form, Taylor includes some other writings and passages that he tries to use to make this sense, again, of this larger sense of trying to find human fullness that goes well beyond secular categories. And one of the quotes that I found particularly arresting comes from a letter that Václav Havel playwright who was, as you know, imprisoned for many years in and out of jails in communist Czechoslovakia, but whose writings managed to shape a lot of ideas about his experience seeking freedom. And at one point, he writes a letter to his wife while he's imprisoned. And this goes to the question for Taylor of how then do we, in a secular age, find connection with our source. Havel is sitting on a rusty pile of iron, and he's gazing up against wires and bars. And he spies then an enormous tree with its leaves quivering in the breeze, trembling against an endless sky. I was overcome by a sensation that is difficult to describe all at once. I seemed to rise above all the coordinates of my momentary existence in the world into a kind of state outside time in which all the beautiful things I have ever seen and experienced existed in a total co-presence. I felt a sense of reconciliation, indeed of an almost gentle assent to the inevitable course of events as revealed to me now. And this combined with carefree determination to face what had to be faced, a profound amazement at the sovereignty of being, became a dazzling sensation of tumbling endlessly into the abyss of its mystery, an unbounded joy at being alive, at having been given the chance to live through all I have lived through, and at the fact that everything has a deep and obvious meaning. This joy, formed by a strange alliance in me with a vague horror at the inapprehensibility and unattainability of everything I was so close to in that moment, standing at the very edge of the infinite. I was flooded with a sense of ultimate happiness and harmony with the world and with myself, with that moment, with all moments I could call up, and with everything invisible that lies behind it and has meaning. I would even say that I was somehow struck by love, though I don't know precisely for whom or what. So there's a hero of the democratic transformation of Czechoslovakia in a prison yard, looking up through wires and bars and seeing a tree trembling in the breeze. And that triggers for him this sense of reflectiveness about, in effect, the totality of being. Now, that's Havel. About 200 years before that, another writer wrote this. I lie on the bosom of the infinite world. At this moment, I am its soul, for I feel all its powers and its infinite life as my own. At that moment, it is my body, for I penetrate its muscles and its limbs as my own, and its innermost nerves are according to my sense of my presentiment. And it mirrors itself in my open soul like the image of the vanishing beloved in the awakened eye of a youth. Now, for the first time, the feeling works its way up from the inside and diffuses itself like a blush of desire on the cheek. This moment is the highest flowering of religion. If I could create it in you, I would be a god. May holy fate only forgive me that I have had to disclose more than the Eleusinian mysteries. That's the Greek shrine where one goes to get answers. And this same writer says, writing to skeptics and cynics, and trying to persuade those cynics and skeptics of how to look at religion. Not the way they tend to belittle religion, as a series of fantasies and fairy tales. He says, "Only cast off as I do everything of that sort, and I will show you miracles and revelations and inspirations of quite another species. To me, everything that has an immediate relation to the infinite is a miracle. And everything finite has such a relation, insofar as I find in it a token or indication of the infinite." What is revelation? Every new and original communication of the universe to man, and every elemental feeling to me is inspiration. The religion to which I lead you demands no blind faith, no negation of physics or psychology. It is wholly natural, and yet again, as the immediate product of the infinite, it is all of grace. Those last two passages come from Friedrich Schleiermacher. They relate, I think, intimately with the experience that Havel is writing about 200 years later. Schleiermacher is writing his sense of the feeling for the infinite in 1799. The American Republic had just emerged, and Schleiermacher was already, as a 30-year-old, hard at work as a romantic thinker, wrestling with the questions of faith, born in part out of the fact that he had been reared in a Moravian community and had understood the power, if you will, of piety, of religiousness, of devotion, with a strong emotional component. Because much of Moravian piety is focused on the suffering of Jesus, and sometimes fairly graphic identification of the wounds and the pain of Jesus. For 3 years, Martha and I attended Home Moravian Church and have a little feeling for the sensibility of the Moravian community. It was during the period that I was at Salem College in Winston-Salem. And Schleiermacher came through that tradition. And all of his initial theological education came with the Moravians. He broke from it because he found there was too much of an emphasis on a kind of emotional identification with the vicarious atonement, which for him was always a challenge. He could never quite understand how somehow the forgiveness depended upon Jesus standing in for him and for all of, if you will, second Adam. That never registered for him, although he was intensely rooted in a sense of feeling, bordering at times, certainly in those 1799 speeches, on a kind of mystical apprehension of God. So Schleiermacher, with that formation, is still very interested in feeling. But as his theology develops, he, again, much like Taylor, is wrestling with the fact that his age is highly secular and his companions are that. It's post-Enlightenment. It's when, if you will, the affirmation of a secular world, for example, in the great philosopher Immanuel Kant has taken hold, where the rationalism of the Enlightenment dare to know, free ourselves from the tutelage of the church as an authoritarian institution, and on our own human capabilities find the truth. Some of the rationalism had worn thin, much of it had, and in the Germany of Schleiermacher, there was this immense concern for a kind of freedom and creativity of the human spirit in artistic forms and in the Romantic movement, in literature and in art and in philosophy. There are these vast, bold, speculative philosophical systems that try to unlock the mysteries of the universe through flights of philosophical imagination and through artistic creation. And Schleiermacher finds all of that highly attractive. But he also, by inclination, by training, is himself a pious Calvinist who sees that there is a deeper dimension to the romantic experience than his colleagues are articulating, who are totally rejecting the Christian tradition. So he wants to say, I agree with you. There's a lot of very difficult and primitive stuff in a lot of the religion that we have inherited. But that's not religion. Religion is the experience of the infinite, and we find it deeply embedded within our self-consciousness. So by the time he then begins his long career, which moves in several different stages, he finds himself both as a professor at the University of Berlin, one of the founders of that university, one of the leaders on the faculty teaching theology, with an extraordinary range of capabilities. He is a philologist. He is an expert in classical languages. He is translating Plato. He's translating other great thinkers. He is also the pastor of of Trinity Church in Berlin, which until it was destroyed in 1945 during World War II, was one of the central major dominant churches in Berlin. And he served as pastor there for some 30 years. While he was doing that, he was also a professor and deeply involved in the intellectual and social life of Berlin, frequenting intellectual gatherings, wide friendships, highly influential. He was one of the main movers in creating the Evangelische Kirche in Germany, the union of the Lutheran and the Reformed Church into a single Prussian church. And in 1821, he finished the first edition of the Christian faith. And in this 700-page book, developed a full systematic theology. And now he shifts from the kind of, if you will, overwrought, highly romantic, emotional prose of the speeches, which many read, in fact, as a kind of almost pantheistic tract of religion, because he's virtually identifying God with the universe. But in the Christian faith, he becomes a much more scientific theologian, and self-consciously is saying we need now to find in systematic theology a way in which we can draw together the different insights, experiences, understandings of faith that come to us in different biblical witnesses, because the themes are scattered through the Bible that have now to be brought together. We want to look at the preaching of the church and find the most resonant ideas that will, again, be unified and brought into a coherent set of relationships. We want then to create an interconnection in the doctrines of the church that have been articulated at various times through the life of the church, the creedal statements, and the other doctrines that the church has affirmed. And we want to make sense out of all those. And in doing so, he has authored a full systematic theology. It is a far more sober and disciplined work of, if you will, analytical reason, but it doesn't root the experience of religion, of piety, religiousness. Piety would be a combination, if you will, of faith and practice, religiousness. He wants to say, let's start with where religion takes hold. Let's start with the fundamental place where piety occurs. And let's begin with that as the center of our theology. And that is not subject to the critique of a scientific age. It is not subject to the repudiation of a speculative philosophical reason. Psychology doesn't analyze it and turn it into something else, because this is sui generis in pious experience. This belongs to the actual foundation of where piety or religiousness comes from. And so he begins this in materials that you might have had a chance to take a look at. And so with the very early paragraphs in the Christian faith, he says this: the piety which forms the basis of all ecclesiastical communions is, considered purely in itself, neither a knowing nor a doing, but a modification of feeling or of immediate self-consciousness. I'll read that again. The piety which forms the basis of all ecclesiastical communions is, considered purely in itself, neither a knowing nor a doing, but a modification of feeling or of immediate self-consciousness. Feeling is immediate self-consciousness. Well, let's unpack this. It's not a knowing. Obviously, there is within the tradition of the church, particularly in some forms of the church, particularly probably at various times in the Roman Catholic tradition, a heavy emphasis upon knowing doctrines. And that the ways in which you define Christian piety is in the affirmation of supernatural truths to which you have access by an act of faith, which enters you into the traditions of the church, things that you could not otherwise know because they're supernatural. You can know once you make an act of faith and accept those teachings. The creeds are a good example of propositions about the nature of religious truth. Schleiermacher says there's a place for knowledge, but it's not the first element in religion. Why? Because you can know all of those doctrinal truths and not necessarily have piety. You can be an expert on the formation of the Trinitarian doctrine at Nicaea and be the most knowledgeable individual in the world and have it not affect anything other than your knowledge. You could actually say the same thing, although we don't usually think of it this way, about having an encyclopedic knowledge of Scripture, but having it not really affect anything except your knowledge. Faith and history are not the same thing. So Schleiermacher says we haven't yet found in knowledge the real basis for religion. Knowledge is important. Religion is going to express itself in knowledge, but it's not the essence of religion. He says the same thing about doing. Well, obviously, within the Christian tradition, there's a huge emphasis upon the things that one must do in terms of deeds of love, service to others, practices of religion itself, that should be understood as the basis of religion. And there are a lot of traditions within Christianity which would say that's where you want to look to find the central form of religion. And Immanuel Kant, the great philosopher, ended up saying there is a way in which we can find a place for religion, and it's in understanding that the categorical imperative, the generalized rules of duty and ethical conduct that we must follow, turn in effect into its own kind of religion. God is defined by the publication, if you will, in our minds of the categorical imperative. And the intensity that it has for us is a way in which we can think about the existence of God by extrapolating out of our sense of duty, deeds, to do the right thing. Schleiermacher says that's all well and good, and that may certainly be part of religion, but it's not its essence. Why? Because every time you think about deeds, agape love, you have to have a motivation. And a motivation comes from feeling. It comes from your self-awareness about the claims taking hold in you that motivate you to act. Now that's not radically different than what you might find in a lot of the Pauline emphases. That the deeds come after the motivation, that faith produces the fruits. And if you get that reversed, you get into terrible problems of the law condemning you for your sinfulness that never can be solved simply by the doing of the deed. So Schleiermacher says, yes, and it's very much like St. Augustine. Faith does seek understanding. And so feeling does have to get fixed in ideas and in concepts and in doctrines. But it doesn't start there. And the same for doing. In the next section, under paragraph 4, it's time now to say, okay, faith is, piety is the immediate self-consciousness. And to understand that, I don't think it's very hard. I think that immediate self-consciousness is the way in which we are present to ourselves. It is self-awareness, immediate self-awareness, without thinking about it or without acting on it. It is not objective self-consciousness. It is not the way we take ourselves as an object of reflection and think about what we maybe have just felt. Example. You have a feeling of guilt, and it's bothering you. And then, that's immediate self-consciousness. Where it becomes objective self-consciousness is when you begin to say, my friend said that I didn't keep my promise. I was supposed to pick him up at noon, and I didn't get there. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, but did I say I was going to be there at noon? I thought I said maybe I was going to be there at noon. And so as you're thinking about your self-reproach, your guilt, you're trying then to make yourself an object of reflection. So you've moved it then into a reflective awareness process rather than an immediate process. This happens once in a while. You wake up and you feel a sense of gratitude. I mean, maybe it's because it's rained for 5 days and suddenly there's a beautiful sun out there, but it's probably also because, you know, maybe your grandchildren sent you a photo, or maybe it's because you suddenly become aware of a sense of joy about this gift of life that you have in no way created. And all you know is you feel joy or thanksgiving. Then you start thinking about it, and maybe you then do trace out the reasons for that joy, and you say, well, that's really because, you know, the person who was ill is now healed, or that there really is an opening to solve that problem that I hadn't really thought about previously. So the joy can translate itself into reflection about the source of that joy. But the joy itself is immediate self-consciousness. It's how we're present to ourselves. And clearly, I think we would all say, that's often what we mean by the word feeling. We might say we have a sense of that, but the word feeling doesn't seem to not apply. So Schleiermacher wants to say that's the sphere within which religion, religiousness, piety, takes hold. That's where it starts. And that, of course, then has to be subject to a lot of other steps for him to build this magnificently long, complex, insightful, and often boring book. So he goes on to say, the common element in all, however diverse, expressions of piety, by which these are conjointly distinguished from all other feelings, or in other words, the self-identical essence of piety is this: the consciousness of being absolutely dependent, or which is the same thing, of being in relationship with God. So in the feeling, we start with feeling. We understand then what feeling is self-presence. And then we say, there is a feeling of absolute dependence that is the essence of piety. It's feeling, but it's a certain kind of feeling. It's the feeling of absolute dependence. And then he differentiates in what is a very interesting modern theologian's process, what I've called the other day when I was here, a kind of archaeology of human consciousness. It's digging deeply into the components, sorting out the ways in which humans experience themselves and their lives, and then building a whole theological system around that. And he does that by saying, well, let's look at our consciousness. And those of you who have had a chance to read some of these texts will know that he says human consciousness, just analyzing it, always shows us that at its foundations there is a sense of ourselves as being and by some means having come to be. We have a sense of ourselves always in relationship to things outside of us and ourselves. And those influences outside of us are of all sorts of things. It could be nature, it could be relationships. All kinds of things affect us. But when we look at the whole of our existence and say, the whole of our existence, all of this collected, spontaneous activity of ours, then against that we have to say, where is the whence? Where is the source of the whole of our existence? We're not looking now at the specific individual causalities that might bring us the health of our bodies or might give us a world in which to inhabit. We're thinking not of the ways in which we have mutual influence on the sources of activity outside of us. We're saying, how do we understand the source of our whole existence, our being here at all? Well, there has to be a whence. There has to be a source. Because you experience yourself as living, but as having no power to live, because you didn't create yourself. Unless there's an exception in the room. So what he's trying to say is that through feeling we gain access to a sense of absolute dependence for the whole of our existence. Then he goes on to do analytical checks on that. He says, well, let's see if we could imagine a situation in which we were entirely free, that our freedom actually was entirely expansive. And there would be nothing against which we would be pushing. And he says, well, you can't imagine that. You can't imagine a sense of absolute freedom, because there's always a limit, starting with the givenness of your own life. That you've received. So if you try to imagine a feeling of absolute freedom, some expansion of your imagination, you can't do it. If you try to imagine, on the other hand, a sense of absolute dependence, you can do that. Now, it's also true that sense of absolute dependence is more tacit than it is explicit. The passage I read you from the speeches where Schleiermacher is saying we feel ourselves lying on the bosom of the universe and feel his powers coursing through us. But that passes. I think you would say that for Schleiermacher, yes, there's probably an ability to find an almost mystical sense of connection to the power that has posited you, but it passes, at least for him. But what he goes on to say is, when we look at the actual space-time circumstances of our experience, when we look at all the changing forms of our engagement in the world of events and happenings, we find that there are times when we experience then religious emotion. This feeling of absolute dependence enters then into the specific forms and actions of our life. And those bring forth the feeling of absolute dependence as colored by religious experiences and practices. And so in one dialogue about Christmas, which is a lot kind of warmer text than the Christian faith, he has characters talking about the importance of Christmas. And he has characters talking in passionate terms about the unqualified joy that the idea of the coming of Jesus represents in the Christian experience of piety. It's hard now to see some of those moments in the way in which we live our current lives around Christmas, but I can remember as a kid, I think I was 7 or 8 years old, I was watching a television show, Arthur Godfrey, and there were people being interviewed by him who were talking about Christmas, and it was probably Christmas Day or Christmas Eve, and there was this sudden sense of joy that people were communicating. And for a kid hoping to get a pony, it was really a time when you felt this unqualified sense of joyousness. And as Schleiermacher tries to talk about joy in the Christian faith, he suggests that that is one of the primary manifestations of absolute dependence in the context of Christian piety. It is all of the experience. It's the preaching. It's the sacraments. It's the life of fellowship with others. It's all the kind of experiences that issue in Christian joy. And that joy is a feeling of absolute dependence colored by a set of religious experiences. Joy and faith and love and humility and gratitude and contrition and guilt. The Christian emotions, then, are where we actually live the faith. Then we go on to think about it and write big books. And then we feel we have to show forth the joy in commitment and action and support, in caring about others, in seeking for justice. But it starts with gratitude, thanksgiving, joy, and those are feelings. Yes, sir?
Going back to an earlier statement you attributed to Schleiermacher about not being able to connect with atonement.
Right.
Where does he get his resolution of being totally dependent on a creator without a means to find place?
I love you. That's great, because he believes powerfully, consistently, and through endless discussions of the redemptive power of Jesus. The cross matters. The cross is a powerful model and exemplification of the redeeming power of Jesus. But it works not through the vicarious atonement theory, in which the idea is that Jesus takes on the sins of the world to satisfy God's retribution. He doesn't like that idea. And that, of course, is present in a lot of theology, and there's ways in which I think he probably could have worked harder to find a more palatable way of understanding it. But he reduces it pretty much to, there's an angry God who needs a penalty paid, and it's going to be through the victim of the guiltless one, and that will satisfy God. He just doesn't resonate with it. And I think it happened when he was in the Moravian experience, where maybe it became such a strictly emotional preoccupation that he went in a different direction. But the redemptive power of Jesus is a central part of his theology. Because when you have the feeling of absolute dependence, now if you start looking through the different doctrines that he then develops, how do you do theology? You do theology by taking this feeling of absolute dependence in its Christian forms and using that as the content of what you can know about God. We don't have access to God then through speculative theories. We don't have access to God through the, if you will, the biblical historical accounts as if they were literal. How do we have access to God? Yeah, we need the theories, and yeah, we need the Bible desperately. Without it, we don't have anything. But what we want to do is find ways in which we really have access to God, and we filter our knowledge of God through the Christian's experience. So, for example, he says, as one good example, the doctrine of creation is to be elucidated preeminently with a view to the exclusion of every alien element. In other words, there was nothing else around when God created. Why? Because if there were, we wouldn't experience absolute dependence. There'd be something else. But he doesn't get there by saying we believe in the creation ex nihilo because Genesis says it. He says Genesis says it, we want to pay attention to that because we can interpret that in ways that help us understand better how the Christian consciousness is the source of theology. And through that, you can only know certain things. You know then that basically the doctrine of God's providence and the doctrine of God's creation reinforce each other and basically are saying the same thing. We totally depend upon God for creation. And we know that through the creation of our own lives, which we did not create. So that then the whole of Christian faith is an effort of showing how the doctrine of absolute, or the idea of absolute dependence is colored in all of the forms of redemption. One of the interesting things about Schleiermacher is that he has a very high doctrine of the church, or the centrality of the church. We come to know Jesus as Redeemer through the church, through the communion of the church, through the fellowship of the church, that members of the church, in effect, create for one another the redemptive power of Jesus. Not alone, because there's the inheritance, obviously, of Scripture. There's the inheritance of the preaching. But the communion, in the way of support and mutual regard, is one of the forms in which the presence of Jesus is made manifest. So the communion of the church is critical and vital. It's not a bad emphasis in a secular world. Yes, sir.
Different question.
Yes, sir.
The conclusion of feeling
Yes.
leading to utter dependence.
Yes.
What about the other potential that it leads to a feeling of total independence?
Except that you don't create yourself. I mean, God has given you what you have. You're given, and all you don't have total freedom. You have partial freedom, because you can, even against nature, you can push back. I mean, you can react to nature in advance of the hurricane coming by getting shelter. So there's a little bit of independence you have there. But against the givenness of your life, God lives through you.
So a human sense of this experience giving me independence ultimately fails.
That's right. Exactly right. Precisely. Precisely. And so, now, we're sinful. What that means is that consciousness of absolute dependence, the consciousness of God, is not fully present in us. The only exception to that is Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ had a total God consciousness. Every event was transparent to the presence of God. For us, we're worried more about whether or not the car is going to start in the morning. We're worried more about whether we look good today. We're worried more about whether we're getting a chance at that next promotion. We're worried about all kinds of things that Jesus wouldn't be worried about. So we take the little pieces of finite experience and we let them block our consciousness of God. Jesus, as the Redeemer, both models and incarnates a way of understanding both human perfection and God's presence in him. In the human perfection of Jesus, we see manifest God because he trusts God and shows in his integrity and in his service and in his forgiveness and in his teaching and in his death, the presence of God, so we can know God. So he's a Calvinist. Sin is not quite as corrupting as it is with John Calvin and Martin Luther, but it confuses us. And the possibilities we have to become full human beings with this transparent sense of God is covered over, and that's why we need the church. Now, what's interesting in all of this work is, well, does this help us understand? Is this consistent with the biblical witness? If you pick up the Bible, do you find this kind of interpretation one that is adequate for interpreting the Bible? The fancy word is hermeneutics. I mean, does Schleiermacher's understanding, when we read the Bible, open up doors in interpretation of the Bible? Does it connect? Is it adequate to the Bible? If you're going to be a Reformed theologian and you can't answer that question positively, you're probably not a Reformed theologian. And so that's something to think about as you look at different biblical texts. Does this sense of God's presence in this way help us with the texts? Does it seem to be adequate to interpreting them? Go to a few passages in Isaiah, and I expect you might find that it's not too far off. The sense of the powerfulness and presence of God. Errol.
Yes, this idea of absolute dependence would seem to me to negate the idea of freedom and joy, because it would seem to make us victims of God's control over every aspect of our lives. So there's no sense of my responsibility, my freedom. And it seems that Taylor's idea of fullness is a much richer concept than absolute dependence. So Schleiermacher's idea of absolute dependence, how does he reconcile that with human responsibility and accountability?
Because I think it's because absolute dependence only relates to the whole of your existence, because you have relative freedom within the context of the ordinary circumstances of your life. So that it's just with regard to your own creation, your own being here. You're given, as in terms of existence, you're given. You have no power over that. You live, but no power to live. And so you have relative freedom in terms of all the finite relationships that you will have in the world. You have the freedom to learn. You have the freedom to grow. You have the freedom to interact in agape love. He would say, because it's relative it's relative freedom. You have relative freedom.
And it seems he ought to drop the word absolute.
It has a special meaning. I don't know German well enough to know it's a choice of a term, and I think there probably are other terms that might even say it better. Although total, I don't know. I mean, but as I say, he's simply trying to. He's trying to say basically, the human being is experiencing what all of creation, how all of creation works. Only we can experience it. And we are sort of the access to understand God's power in the creation of all things, including human beings, only we do have relative freedom. I'm going to let you go, or I'm going to be in trouble with everyone.
Chuck and Russ will be passing out next week's reading materials at the door. So pick one up, one per family. As you walk out, please. We'll see you
Now we're
next
going to go
week.
to